I'm also going to introduce Mike Lopez at Aft Associates. He is leading the Migrant Seasonal Head Start study, and he's also involved in other research studies, but that's the one that I wanted to really note, because when we think about the complexity, as I just described it, it doesn't get more complex than figuring out how to evaluate and learn from the communities that are in the Migrant Seasonal Head Start world. So, and Veronica Fernandez is on faculty at University of Miami, and she provides a lot of research consultation to Teach Stone, and has developed expertise in DLL very quickly. Her study area is more broad than that, but she and I have been spending a lot of our time reading the literature on DLL, and also want to mention our research scholar, Lisa White, who is our first to be funded through Teach Stone doctoral scholar, who has been focused on DLL research and designed her dissertation study to use the CASEBA. Have you all heard of the CASEBA? Raise your hand if you've. So it is a DLL measurement approach, but does not have the psychometric qualities that the class has. So we're supporting partners in learning about how relevant the class the CASEBA can be, or other instructional measures can be, based on the strengths that they present. And you'll hear in this session a lot of different approaches. So Lisa has the CASEBA in hers, and we funded her to include class so we can see alongside what we can learn about using the two together. And she may chime in later during the interact portion of the session to tell us what she's learned early on. So with that, I want to introduce Veronica Fernandez to kick off the session. Right?
Actually, I was just going to give a brief introduction and tie it to the question that was asked earlier, and Bob's mention of the importance of focusing on unique populations while also considering what the class does so well, which is considering what the broader common global measures of quality is. But Jennifer did a great job of introducing that. So today we're going to talk about what we're going to be focusing on today is why we're focusing on dual language learners, what do we know about effective practices with dual language learners, and these are some of the questions that we're going to pose to you. So maybe start to think about how you may want to respond and what you think about the answers of these questions. Does the class work as an observational tool in classrooms with DLLs, and also is the class sufficient by itself for use with DLLs? So that's what we're going to be talking about. Our focus is really going to be what the research tells us about these, and hopefully some of you in the room are more practitioner oriented and are in programs that are using the class, and you can help to bring that practitioner perspective to the conversation as well. So first question.
Pop quiz.
All right, so it's for the audience. Why do you think it's important to focus on dual language learners? How many of you work with dual language learners within your practice? Yeah. So who would like to volunteer to talk about why it's important to think about and bring dual language learners into the conversation when we're talking about interactions and measuring interactions in our programs?
Most of our curricula that we work with is set up to meet mainstream English learners, and we know from research that dual language learners need to have a strong foundation in their primary language and be able to use those skills to transfer that learning to the second language, which is usually English. So if we don't have a focus on building those skill sets and building the foundation in that first language, they're not going to be able to comprehend and perform academically at the level of the curriculum that we have in mainstream English.
Right, and that's going back to Bob's point earlier, which is what you focus on is what changes, right? So I think your point is well taken, that if we're not bringing dual language learners into the conversation and thinking about what their unique needs are and what we're doing to support development of those needs, we're not going to see changes in that respect. Great, anybody else? So why focus on DLLs?
And when you make your comments, it would be great if you could tell us your name and where you're from, because we want to learn where everyone's from. So
I'm Olayinka Ojo, and I'm from Texas.
Texas, the whole state of Texas.
From the Dallas area.
Okay, great. So you're absolutely right. I think Jill's point is really what we wanted to start off with. And this is probably not news to folks in the room. It's one of those obvious questions, but the obvious statement is that you have the changing demographics of the population, and particularly in early childhood. Now, when I refer to a lot in what I'm going to talk about around DLLs, I'm talking mainly about Spanish-speaking Hispanic DLLs, since that's the largest population group. But as it was to discuss this morning, there's a huge range of DLL in Fairfax. You know, I know when we were doing some Head Start work with the Head Start Impact Study, there were 100 and some odd different language groups in just the Fairfax area because of the uniqueness of that area. And there are other places where there are similarly diverse populations. But for many situations, I often think about it in terms of three groups. You have your English-speaking group, you have your Spanish-speaking Hispanic group, and then you have everyone else. And it's not just because I'm Hispanic and I like Hispanics, but it has to do with just sheer critical mass. It's the largest group, it's one of the fastest growing groups. It's a group that it's hard to find any place in this country, even in small rural places, where you're not dealing with a rapidly growing population of dual language learners, Spanish-speaking dual language learners, let alone others. So this is going to be a very Hispanic-centric, and so my apologies to those, but it's intended to be a fully representative rainbow. And so just in Head Start alone, where there's a rapidly growing population, and 38% of children served in Head Start are Hispanic. And when you look at the overall population growth, that's one of the fastest growing groups. Actually, Asians is a faster growing group, but smaller in total numbers. And then clearly there's a high overlap between Hispanic and those who come from Spanish-speaking homes, non-English-speaking homes, with in some cases it's around 80%, where you get children who come from different backgrounds. And there's a whole range, there's a continuum. If we were talking about DLL assessment issues, which is a whole nother conference talk that we could have, that I've done a lot of work on, it's a whole range that just because you're Hispanic and come from a Spanish-speaking household doesn't mean that you're necessarily monolingual Spanish-speaking. You could be bilingual, you could be balanced bilingual. There's a whole continuum, and that has to be taken into account not only for direct child assessment issues, but also for observational measures in understanding what's going on in the classrooms. And then with this growth in the population, you get a growth in the access and utilization of early care and education programs. Hence why we're talking about it as a relevant topic today. Go ahead, next slide. So why do we care? Just the population increase. There's clearly a reason that we care. And we know from the research that kindergarten, starting early, even sometimes before kindergarten entry, Hispanic kids, DLL kids, are often behind non-DLL kids, and they start behind and often stay behind. And so there's a huge concern about the achievement gap. In addition, they're also often more likely from low-income backgrounds and go into lower quality programs. And so there's a real concern. Just, I know in Head Start's DLL report to Congress, just citing some of the data on the instructional support, and I think Jennifer, you had pulled this through, that when you look at the quality, the instructional support in programs with high DLLs, it's much lower than overall in Head Start.
So you see on that last line in this slide, that's very mentionable. It's quite remarkable in a bad way, the different levels of quality.
I don't know if there's data on this, but can't we fairly confidently also say that in classrooms with mixed populations, the DLLs tend to get fewer interactions, lower quality interactions, and less instruction?
Hold that thought, because that's exactly one of the relevant points that when we come to the actual measurement consideration. That's perfect point. So before we get to the measurement, let's go to what do we know in terms of about effective. Oh, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So what, for those of you who are in programs with DLLs, what do you know about effective practices? So in terms of, as we were saying, if you don't focus on the needs of DLL students, you're not going to see changes in their development. So what are the things that we know matter and are critical for development of DLL specifically?
Using a lot of visuals, doing a lot of songs, chants, focusing on their own language.
Okay. Yeah. Anybody else? So visual supports, right? If language is a barrier for these children, using visual supports would be helpful to them. Anybody want to?
Somebody mentioned earlier, you mentioned.
Yes, in using the visual supports and songs and rhymes, it's important to use authentic information. So for example, if we're teaching rhyming in a bilingual Spanish class, we can't translate Humpty Dumpty
Right.
and still keep onset rhyme and the pattern in the song. So we need to find authentic Spanish-based chants and nursery rhymes where the children can hear the concept of what they're supposed to learn out of the activity.
Yeah, and that's a consideration in the research field too. A lot of times when we're thinking about, okay, we want to measure this same outcome with these diverse populations, let's just translate a measure from English to Spanish, which doesn't quite. And I really like that Humpty Dumpty example, and I'm going to start integrating it into the examples of why we can't just translate measures from English to Spanish. Maybe I'll do that. I'll do a verbatim translation of Humpty Dumpty and open that way and really freak people out, and then say, this is why you can't do that with measures. So thank you for that. I'll definitely cite you on my presentations. All right, so what does the research say? Right?
Well, and actually before we get to the research, part of this has been, in the early childhood field, people have been looking at what are some of the effective approaches. And they've identified a number of different key areas that are thought to promote DLL development and learning. And if you look at this list, you see that there are issues that cluster into curriculum and instructional practices considerations, program characteristics, both structural and process quality, teacher knowledge and skills, and then even family engagement. And do you notice something about this list? What jumps out at you about this list? Anything jump out at you? I see Bob. Bob, you can't, I know you know the answer to this one. This is Bob's point. So some of this, if you look at it and you think, okay, so these are all relevant for DLLs. Now, take off your DLL hat and look at it. All kids. Okay, so that is that's an important thing that we're going to, it's kind of like Bob's focus comment. That's going to come up again and again. What's DLL specific and what's good for all kids? That, if nothing else, I want you all to walk out of here thinking about this balancing of these two issues. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not, but they're also not one and the same. And so I think we need to think about that, what's good for everyone, that kind of universal aspect, and what's good for DLLs, because it's like a Venn diagram, two overlapping spheres of work. And this, so this work that had come out really talks about kind of these important characters. And yes, they're important, but in trying to figure out, so what does this mean in terms of getting at under the hood of those DLL specific aspects, a lot of people in the field have been struggling with, okay, so what do we know from the literature on it? And if we go to the next slide. So when you actually look at what we know from the literature, a lot has been drawn on two major research syntheses, the National Literacy Panel and then the CREED, Educating English Language Learners Report. These are kind of like the two bigger reviews that have been done. And there's a couple others that are listed down there that have also looked at what do we know from the literature? Because again, basing this on the evidence of what people have looked at and examined and have shown to be effective with dual language learners in terms of instructional practices. So Jennifer, just next slide. So one of the key things, and I think our friend from Texas over here mentioned that, and that is the use of the home language instruction. And teaching children to read, and not only teaching children to read, but also oral language. I think you had mentioned the oral language use. In the home language helps promote achievement in the second in English. And so have many of you heard the whole notion of cross-language transfer and how basically your fundamental skills that you have in your home language are going to help you, except when it comes to idioms and nursery rhymes, going to help you translate. Try doing idioms. I mean, when you think about idioms in English, don't translate well in Spanish. It's not just Humpty Dumpty. It's because there's not a whole lot of use of idioms in Spanish, so it drives people nuts when they think about some of those. So it comes back to the use of the home language, and there are many different approaches, but the language of instruction, and so how many of you have programs that have a clear, intentional, bilingual instructional approach?
Where are you?
So
What? Oh,
oh yeah. So only. So what's interesting about that is that when we asked earlier, when Veronica asked earlier, how many of you work with DLLs, a lot more hands raised than the two that have a specific intentional curricular focus on language of instruction, right? So why the gap? What's the difference?
And I think that part of the gap may be because of our assessment system, right? So when we are preparing these children in preschool to enter kindergarten, the language in which they're being assessed for kindergarten entry is in English, right? But what the research is saying is actually if we support their home language, they are going to be better at English. But we're sort of missing maybe that translation of research into practice and helping practitioners to understand that if you build the home language, English acquisition is going to be an easier process. And perhaps that message is being missed, or perhaps we don't have the teachers in the rooms that can support the home language. But I think it's an important message to start getting out there.
No, and that's a good point. How many of you are from California? In Southern California? The LA area? Only one? So I've done a lot of work, and I'll talk about this in a minute. When they had First Five LA, when they did their big preschool expansion, a $600 million expansion of preschool, and they were focusing on the underserved, and it turned out to be probably around 75 to 80% were from Spanish-speaking homes, Hispanic Spanish-speaking homes. And so it was it became the issue, not a subgroup issue, and which kind of led to some of the work on the DLL assessment stuff and some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in a minute on the class, because it was no longer a marginal issue, it was a primary issue. But one of the things that we found, that and then a study that I worked on with Veronica and colleagues in Miami, is that in two places, Los Angeles and Miami, two places where you think you have some of the largest Hispanic population in the country, right? And yet the preschool context, when we went into the actual classrooms, more often than not, we saw what Veronica was just describing, where there was very little Spanish instruction going on in these classrooms. You think if you can't find it in LA and Miami, where are you going to find it? And so I think that we've missed the boat, and as a former Californian, when they passed Prop 227, I think that we as a field have done a disservice to the general public, especially the DLL general public, in that parents will feel that in order for my child to succeed, as Veronica alluded to, they need to learn English, because English is a language of commerce. So in order for, and of success, and so in order for my child to succeed, they need to learn English. And the path to getting there is where we've failed. The path to getting there is go from Spanish to English, so it's like sink or swim, rather than how do you use the strengths of the home language, not only for the child, but also for the parent, because how many of you believe parent engagement is important? Everybody better raise your hand, all right? That's not even it. So if you come from a household where the parents are predominantly non-English speaking, of whatever language, and you say that English is the only important language, how likely are you going to be facilitating parent engagement, right? So I think we failed, and we're now trying to play catch up with this. But so it's clear that what we know from the research, so you have to separate out what we think in terms of conceptually versus what do we know empirically. And what we know from the research is really that home language promotion in some of the various different models really makes a difference. And there's different ways of slices and dices that we don't need to go into here. But it comes back to also that in these reviews they made that comment, they reached that conclusion again that when you have the typical components of effective instruction for DLLs, it really is some of the same issues that apply for all kids. So again, back to that balance of what's good for all kids and what's good for DLLs. But there are some accommodations that can be necessary, and people have already mentioned a few of them. There are a number of different ways, because when you think about it, children are often learning not only the content, but they're also learning the language. And so you're kind of doing double duty when you come in as a primarily non-English speaking DLL. You're doing two things at once. So the scaffolding of whether it's the rhymes or the use of pictures and other strategies for scaffolding those language interactions, building on the cognates, those words that are similar across languages. So you're building those connections across the languages using cognates. Specific intentional vocabulary strategies to build a strong vocabulary and to improve comprehension through all these other efforts. Those are all different accommodations, but it still doesn't mean that you have to ignore the fact that good quality instruction is still good quality instruction. So that's, again, back to that theme. All right. So while we've come a long ways, and some of these syntheses have identified some of these specific areas that are important, there's a lot of promise, and there's a lot of encouraging areas that people are focusing on. But these effects are relatively small to modest. They're not overwhelming, not earth-shattering, especially if you think about a what works clearinghouse type review and the strength of the evidence. And so there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And so we have some, but we still have a lot more that needs to be done. Next slide.
Okay.
Yeah. Back to the study that I had mentioned before in LA. As we were designing the study, I was helping them design the study. We realized that, well, number one, the population is probably going to be about 70 to 80%. That we were projecting, we didn't know at the time, DLLs. And so therefore we need direct assessments that would be appropriate. And so that led to a whole line of work on looking at measures. It also meant that what are we going to be capturing in the classrooms? And that's when we started struggling with this issue. And I'll talk about some of the measures that we started looking at. But in that whole inquiry process, trying to figure out, so what are we going to capture? We realized that the very issue that you mentioned, that we often think of assessing classroom quality as the average child in the average classroom. And when you think about DLLs, you're often, and I think you might have mentioned this, that you often have, in a given classroom, you often have a subgroup who are DLLs and a subgroup who are not DLLs. And in my world, I used to work for the federal government overseeing all the Head Start research. So in Head Start, we often would get this kind of mix. And so you have a lead teacher and an assistant teacher. Well, oftentimes you have, and I'm sure I see some heads already starting to nod, you often have in a classroom, when it comes to the interaction, you have a lead teacher who may be an English-speaking lead teacher and an assistant teacher who's a Spanish speaker. And then when it comes to instructional activities, you often have what I started calling the sub-classrooms of, for the DLLs, the assistant teacher is often the one providing some of the instructional activities for the subgroup of DLLs, right? Does that sound like a familiar? I see a lot of heads. So when we're assessing classroom quality, it's classroom quality for whom and how are we getting it? And that really led us to this whole kind of exploration. So, and unfortunately Bob left, but I still want to thank Bob again for this collaboration, because we worked on this paper together. We approached him and said, what do you know from all the work that's been done with the class and all the studies that have been done with the class, especially the 11-state multi-site study, about how the class is functioning for DLLs? And so, because we were starting to look at all the different measures and the evidence behind it. And so I said, well, we haven't really gotten into that, but we'll do it, but you have to work with us on it. So I said, all right, I will. So this is what led to this paper that we're going to talk about here. Has anyone, actually, I'm going to see, this is one of the questions that I have a bet on. Has anyone read this paper?
Yeah.
Damn it.
I was a research assessor for the project.
So how many hands?
Two, three.
Well, not you two. So where are you from?
Oh, she's Keystone.
Oh, Keystone. Well, that's not fair. Anyone non-Keystone. Yeah. Okay. This is, well, you'll see why in a moment. So this is what's kind of led to this conversation that we've had. No, I'm okay with that. It's like, I'm not going to take it personally, but I think it's an important thing to understand, because it gets at the heart of the current debate about, should you be using the class for DLLs, for DLL classrooms? And to me, that's not necessarily the right question. It's this balance act. It's how. Right.
Is it available online?
It is. It is. And we can always get it to you. So I'm not going to talk about the class, about the dimensions of the class, but just remember, the 3 dimensions. You all know it. You've memorized it. You've got it inside out. So in this effort, we had 2 major questions that we wanted to ask. And the first was, do the dimensions of the class, can they be replicated when you look at classrooms with different compositions of DLLs or Latino? We did it both ways, high versus low. And then the second question is, so basically, is it functioning, that first question, is it functioning similarly across these contexts? And then the second one is, when you use the class, and the 3 dimensions, are those 3 dimensions, emotional, organizational, and instructional support, similarly predictive of outcomes? You know how Bob was talking earlier about the class predicting child outcomes. Does it predict child outcomes similarly for DLL children, DLL/Latino children? Those are our 2 main driving questions. And so we drew, and I won't talk too much about the study since we'll make sure to share it with all of you. It was a huge data set, 11 states, 720 classrooms, class observations, and direct assessments and teacher ratings. A lot of data, basically. I know. And so basically, the finding, and there's a huge, very complicated kind of set of analyses around this, but essentially we found that, lo and behold, the psychometric properties of the class hold up regardless of whether or not you have high versus low DLLs. So it's functioning. So when you think about this as a yardstick, the yardstick that you don't want a yardstick when you use a yardstick to measure Jennifer's height versus Veronica's height, you don't want it to give you different answers if they're exact same height. You want it to say the same thing. You guys are not the same height, but so basically it says that it's functioning psychometrically comparably across. And then the second one, looking at the predictive abilities, essentially, actually you can go on to the next one. You see that the class, first the class, the different dimensions of the class did predict the outcomes across these different the assessed outcomes, both direct assessment and teacher reported, and it wasn't differentially predictive for DLLs versus non-DLLs, so it was comparably predictive. So in other words, the measure functions in terms of its capturing, it's functioning similarly across DLL versus non-DLL, and it's predicting comparably, which to me says, what does it tell you? There you go. So that it functions equally well and that it predicts equally well. And so it's a reasonably good measure. But then that leads to the next question, is that enough?
Right, so this study and other studies that have been done before and after support the use of the class in these diverse classrooms. It's capturing quality in the same way across these classrooms, but is there room for refinement? Do you think that there's room for refinement? Yes, of course there is, right? So some of the things that have been brought up in conversations with practitioners, in some efforts from Teachstone to survey users of the class at different levels. They've surveyed coaches and directors and teachers and programs, and just in other conversations like sessions like this, things that have been brought up is the importance of language and culture match between observers in the classroom, and I'm happy to hear that that's already happening in your program, but we know that that's not happening everywhere. So some sort of universal recommendation to ensure that these language matches are in place. Also, recommendations for specific qualifications of observers. Is there a level of competence or certification aside from understanding the class tool and being reliable? Should the observers have a certain level of qualifications before they're out there? Also, starting to prepare materials that are bilingual and culturally appropriate for training materials. So, for example, having some dual language classrooms in the videos for reliability, or in some of the training videos, preparing materials so that people are not just doing direct translations during professional development, but preparing some materials that are in multiple languages that can be used across programs, and both videos and descriptions. And one of the questions that we're struggling with, should this be something that happens universally because we live in a diverse world? Should everybody be going through this process, or should this be some sort of badge or certification that you've gone through this additional step to be appropriate or certified to go into these diverse classrooms? And also this notion of supplementing rather than changing the tool. So as Bob was saying earlier, and as we've seen through the research and both your own practice, the class is doing a really good job of measuring these common features of quality. What is the global quality, right? So what is being taught in the classroom? But we're serving diverse needs of children, and there may be other things that we have to measure in order to capture this. So we have to go ahead, Teachstone's doing this stuff. These are some of the actions. What do we want to finish with? We have like 2 minutes.
Yeah, we have like 2 minutes. I just want to, we have the last section we were going to talk about some of these alternative approaches and the other strategies. And I just wanted to put this one up because as part of this whole inquiry work that we were talking about, working with Bob and others, we ended up doing a big national symposium, brought together people from all around the country who are working on measurement development efforts on this specific topic. And as a result of the work with his center, they ended up publishing this particular book, which I would encourage you, if you're interested in these issues, I would encourage you to get this book, because it reviews, what we did is we brought together all these different people who are working on the different measures. So it has different chapters that talk about the different people who have done some of this measurement development work, because we wanted to find measures that had some measurement work on, some psychometrics. Now, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but that's where, Lisa's work at the CASEBA, and actually in San Francisco, Gloria had done with AIR, done a study with the CASEBA. So people are starting to look at these strategies for pairing the class as a measure of overall classroom quality with something else that gets at specific DLL instructional practices. You could also do it if you're interested in math instruction.
Right.
You could do the class plus something else, because again, what's the theme? The theme is overall quality and the specific aspects that you're interested in. And they're not mutually exclusive, but you need to think carefully about what's your question that you're trying to get at, and how are you going to answer it? So it shouldn't, to me, it's not pitting the class versus, but it's what do you add onto the class to get at that additional set of information.
And just from a good measurement perspective, no one tool is supposed to give you all of the information you've ever wanted or didn't want to know about something. So the class is one very good, reliable, and valid tool, but that should be part of a larger measurement approach when you're thinking about improving the quality or measuring the quality of your program. So just one last thing that I wanted to say is that we were delinquent and we haven't made these slides available to you yet, but we will put them on that Dropbox, and I'll also include our email addresses. So if any of you want to follow up, if you ever want to talk about collaboration, or if you ever want me to send you some research that could help to support what it is. No, not on the phone. I'm terrible on the phone, but I was going to say that if you can put on the subject line Interact 2016 so that I will respond to you. I have like hundreds of students every semester and I ignore some emails, so I don't want to ignore yours. But part of the support that I'm providing to Teachstone is that research support, and that can be extended to the users of the class as well. If there's ever any research that you want to help have synthesized and understand that can help you with your implementation of the class, I'd be happy to do that as well.
And I'm happy to put the copy of the psychometric paper on there for those who are brave enough, and I say brave enough, to actually venture down that pathway, but so you'll have it available.
And so if you don't want to read the book or Mike's paper, what we can do is, I think the slides summarize what's in that book. And so it's the Cliff Notes version of what's in the book. And Lisa has also started drafting a DLL literature review related to class that we have in draft form. So we'll be getting that out soon, which will have all of this information too. So we're hoping to cut down your stack of reading. And so you can reach out to us anytime to get draft versions or talking points to help kind of categorize all of these different complicated parts of implementation.
Did you say it's a DLL literature review related to the class?
Yes, yes.
And when is that coming out?
When is that coming out? Well, it's in draft form, so probably in the next month.
Yeah.
She looks at me like, are you going to read it?
I know, yeah, so it's already in draft form, so soon. We will get it out quickly.
Fill out the surveys, the
Yes.
session surveys as well. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thanks for coming.
Thank you.